from the Penn Libraries.
My name is Caitlin Shanley. I'm the Educational Technology Librarian for the Weigel Information Commons in Van Pelt Library. I'm joined today by Anu Vedantam, who is the Director of the Weigel Information Commons. She's going to be here to help me out and answer any questions that may come up in the chat. So if you do have questions at any time, feel free to just put them in the chat window and we'll make sure to go over them. This is designed to be as interactive as possible in the online environment. So this is the first time we've offered this workshop online. I've taught it in person a couple times. I wanted to make sure to give credit to my colleague David Takafandi, who's the lab coordinator for the Vitali Digital Media Lab here in Weigel. He and I worked really closely on designing this workshop, and he found a lot of the amazing images that you're going to be looking at today. So we've done this a few times, but this is the first time that we're doing it online. So thank you so much for being here. All right, so we'll go ahead and jump in. So sort of defining infographics, what is an infographic? So I have a hunch that probably most of you have seen them before if you're attending this session, but we want to go ahead and define that so we can start taking a deeper look. So we just pulled a definition probably from Wikipedia. So infographics, what are they? They are graphic visual representations of information, data, or knowledge intended to present complex information quickly and clearly. And I think the last part of that definition is sort of the most important part. We're looking at very complex information, and the quick and the clear both come into play. So this is the first of several infographics about infographics that we'll look at today, but I think it's a pretty nice one using Legos. So infographic is data. It's sorted, it's then arranged, so you can see the relationships between different things. And then last, it's presented in a visual way. So we hear a lot about infographics. They're sort of trendy right now, but it's kind of interesting. If you look back, you can see that the idea of representing information in a graphical form is not exactly a new thing, and we found a couple of pretty cool older examples. So this is a lithograph from 1846, and you can see it shows it's kind of graphing the height of the tallest mountains in the world and then the lengths of the longest rivers and putting those two together. So this is a form that you've seen kind of for a long time. It's not totally new. Another example, this is from 1911. It's a print that's illustrating the structure of capitalism. So the idea of doing this kind of thing and some of these conventions have been around for a long time. So what makes a good infographic? So this is sort of what's new about this form. So I think that this is a really good illustration of what makes an infographic successful and what is unique about an infographic rather than other types of representations of information. So it kind of has this unique blend of 4 different factors. You have data, you have a story that you have to tell, you have shareability, so there's a way to get it out there quickly, and then you have design. And the 4 of these really come together to form a good infographic. And if you have a couple, but not all of them, you can see this sort of divides it up. So if you have data and design, but you don't have any story and you can't share it, then it might be underachieving. If you have a story and you could share it, but you didn't really use any data, you didn't use design to accomplish that, then it could be embarrassing. So I just thought this was a nice representation of sort of what makes this form unique and what makes it successful. So we're going to look at a few examples. We won't go through too many, just examples, because we're going to look at a few in depth, but just to show you a couple of ones that we found that we thought were pretty cool. And again, if you have any questions or if you're having any audio difficulties, please just feel free to say something in the chat and we'll try to make sure we can fix that. So just a couple examples of infographics. This is one that I thought was pretty fun. So this is the circles of hell in Dante's Inferno, but it's represented using sort of video game imagery. So this is one thing you'll see often in infographics, kind of using the conventions of one form and putting it in a new form. So using this sort of old school video game illustration to talk about a very old text is kind of a good example of something that infographics do a lot. Give you another second just to look at it. It's got a lot going on. This is one called From Woof to Squeak. So it's charting the most popular pets in the United States. So I think this is interesting for a couple of reasons. First, it's obviously in black and white. A lot of infographics use color in an interesting way or a fun way, but it's not always necessary to use color. So if you have constraints in the publication that you're trying to create an infographic for, if it's for a journal or newspaper, you can actually do a lot using shape and type and other elements of design other than color. So I think this accomplishes that in a really interesting way. So you can see that in addition to just telling you what the most popular pets are, they're illustrated on there, and they're also illustrated by size. So you can see the fish is a lot bigger than the horse, or a little bit bigger, which is not how it happens. The dog is not bigger than a horse. So this is graphing the size of these animals represents the popularity. So I thought that that was a nice eye-catching and a unique way to represent this data. This is an infographic that talks about cruise ships. So everything from just how massive cruise ships are to how much consumption happens on them, lots of different elements of telling this story about cruise ships. So one thing you'll notice as you look at infographics, there's a convention for them to be very, very, very long. So on the left-hand side of this slide, you can see that's the infographic in full. And then on the right side is just a detail from right in the center of that infographic. So one of the reasons that you'll see this, infographics are designed for viewing on screens, whether it's on a phone or on a computer screen. So in that environment, you can put a lot of information because you can have people continue to scroll down. So that's one of the reasons that they're designed that way. If you printed this out, it wouldn't be so easy to do. You'd have to find quite a long printer. So this is sort of a form that is designed with viewing on the web or on mobile devices in mind. So what can I do with an infographic? Why choose an infographic to represent data when you have so many choices? So we thought of a few of the different kind of ways we saw infographics being used. So I want to just go through a couple of those with you today. So one example of something you might do with an infographic is show a process. So kind of a fun one is the Gangnam Style dance. So this goes through the 5 basic steps of doing that dance. And you can see at the bottom with the footsteps illustrated, you might recognize that foot illustration that shows dance steps. That's something that's been around for a little while. I've been using that graphic to teach people how to dance for a long time. But this also incorporates other elements of illustration and makes it look a little bit more modern and more fun. So I can't see you, of course, but I trust that you're all practicing your Gangnam Style dance now. This is another graphic that shows a process. So this is illustrating what happens in between you putting your search terms into the Google search box and them showing you your results, which is a very complicated process. This is attempting to break that process down and show you what the different steps are. So those are 2 examples of showing a process. Another thing that you may want to do with an infographic is show geographic or spatial relationships, and these are some of the infographics that we see most often. So notably, a map is an example of an infographic. So this is a graphic showing the 2004 presidential election data, red indicating Republican, blue indicating Democrat. So you can see at a glance. One thing that I think is really interesting about this graphic is that it helps you to actually learn something about your data in addition to just showing it to other people. So we kind of have a perception that we have red states and blue states, and it's a very divided nation, but this kind of shows that it's called Purple America. So it shows us something about that data in a very visual and quick and easy to understand way. You can actually learn something about the data that you're looking at. Another example of showing spatial relationships. This is a spatial infographic showing someone's room. So just kind of the layout of a room and where things are located can be an infographic. Floor plans are an infographic that we see pretty commonly. This one is illustrating it's actually the Soviet pavilion from the 1958 World's Fair, so another old school example. But buildings can be terribly complex, so a floor plan is an example of one way to take all the data that is what is in this building and try to distill it in a way that's easy to understand and helps you accomplish your goal of finding the space you need to find. One strength of infographics is that you can show information in multiple ways in one design. So this is a graphic that I think is pretty cool. It's a periodic table of visualization methods, so different kinds of charts, different types of ways to visualize data. And if you Google this, you'll see that this periodic table of visualization methods is actually a document on the web that has some live sort of pop-ups. So when you mouse over any of these individual types of visualizations, it'll actually pop up showing you an example of that visualization. So you can see sort of the wide range of choices you can make. And you'll notice that most infographics don't have just one visualization. They use several different visualizations within one graphic. So one example of that, this is a infographic about a Ferrari, so just representing the incredible range of data about one machine that's available and showing you information in several different ways. So there's an illustration, there are some charts, there's text, so several different ways to represent information that are all put together in one form. Giving you a couple extra seconds to look because there's a lot going on here. So we often talk about images or illustrations with infographics, but it is possible to just use text as the visual element to your design in addition to explanatory information. So this is an example of a map of Italy that uses words to talk about different regions and sort of the stereotypes that are associated with those different regions. And there's a shape here, but there aren't pictures per se, or a couple of icons, but the story is mostly told using text. This is an example I like to show. It was actually designed by one of the undergraduate students who works here in the Vitali Digital Media Lab. She is volunteering for Relay for Life and wanted to create a flyer for their event using the infographic conventions. So I've seen a lot of Relay for Life flyers in my life, and I think that this is one that I would stop and look at it because it's very visually interesting. So I think she did a great job using some of these conventions to put a lot of text on a page, but to group things and show hierarchies and illustrate what she's trying to get across in a really visually interesting way, even though there is a lot of text. One pretty common example of an infographic using text is a word cloud. So there's a tool called Wordle, W-O-R-D-L-E, that I've used a lot that will create a word cloud like these. In just a couple of seconds, you can copy and paste a bunch of text in there. You can put a website URL and it will spit out a cloud that shows you the text from that site. The way a word cloud works, the larger the text appears, the more often it shows up on the page or in the text that you copied and pasted. Thanks, Anu, for putting that URL in the chat there. So these were created using Wordle. And this is actually the text from the vice presidential debates from 2008 between Sarah Palin and Joe Biden. So one thing I thought might be break up me talking a little bit and give you just a little pop quiz. Now that you've looked at these for a couple of seconds, I want to ask you to see if you can pick which speech is Joe Biden's and which one is Sarah Palin's. So given these two word clouds showing all of the words that they said, which of these speeches, I'll just ask you which of these speeches is Joe Biden? So I'm going to pop a poll into the window here, and hopefully it won't cover up too much of the text. So if you're there and you think you have a guess or you know for sure which one of these speeches, which candidate said which one of these speeches, give you 2 more seconds to pick. Oh, people are changing their answers. Interesting. All right, so we've got a couple of votes for top. Most people voted the bottom. So most people are correct. The bottom word cloud here is actually showing Joe Biden's speech. I think it's interesting. He actually talks about John McCain or refers to him by name more often than Sarah Palin. So very good. Excellent job, everyone. So word clouds are kind of fun. And again, this is an example of a way to learn something about your data really quickly. So I used to work at a library that did a user survey every year that allowed for open response. And I would plug the results from the survey into Wordle, and we could see really easily if there were any trends, if our survey participants mentioned the same thing over and over again. Obviously, we'd go back through and do some more complex data analysis, but if you want to see just in a couple of seconds, is there any big trend that I should know about right away in here, a word cloud is a fun way to find that out. This is another example of a graphic that uses the sort of word cloud look to talk about African elephants and poaching. So again, using a shape, but not necessarily too many pictures to tell a pretty powerful story. Okay, so another way you'll see infographics used is to classify data to show how things are related to each other. So this is an example of the various varieties of vegetables, hard to say. So grouping things together if they're squash or leafy greens and just showing you the wide variety. And then if you like this, you might like that sort of a thing in a pretty cool way. Yes, so if you're a vegetarian, there are many options out there for you. You may not even have heard of them. this is an infographic of cheese. So sort of categorizing different types of cheese. It's probably a little hard to see on the screen, but there's a lot going on in this infographic. So the colors mean something, the sort of where those arrows are placed indicate whether it's a sharp cheese or soft cheese or stinky cheese. So there's actually many different data points in this graphic that are being illustrated. So it's a pretty cool way to look at all these different varieties of cheese and see how they're related to each other. A little bit different from the two food ones. This is the villains in Gotham. So if you're a comic book fan, all of the different villains from the Gotham world where Batman lives. So this is actually printed out in our lab if you wanted to see what it looks like a little bit larger format. So it's a very complex sort of saga. How are all of these different villains related to each other? Who's connected to whom? That segues nicely into the sort of idea of networks or connections. So not just how things are grouped together, but how does one thing move into another. So this is called the Money Network. It shows there are social web startups, so things like LinkedIn and Twitter, Facebook, the founders of those companies, and then other big corporations, and then how the money kind of travels in between these corporations and startups. So it's really interesting and complex. This is from the New York Times, and if you're interested in that, I recommend taking some time to look at it because it's pretty interesting. In the same sort of vein, big corporations and what are the connections? How do they relate to one another? What are the brands from those companies? So this is something that's incredibly complex. This is a way to represent it that's complicated, but a little bit easier to understand. Oh, yep, thanks. There's a link in the chat for you if you want to check that one out. This is the rock and roll metro map. So again, the idea of using a convention from one type of visualization in a totally new way. So this looks exactly like a subway map, but it's actually charting different rock and roll bands. So each stop on the map is a band, and each of the lines is a different sort of genre within rock. So there's like the pop line, there's a punk line, alternative, heavy metal, and then you can sort of transfer at the bands that kind of cross over. So using this convention to tell a totally different story in kind of a cool way. So far we've mostly looked at representations of quantitative data. You can also use an infographic to tell an anecdote or talk about qualitative information or tell stories. So this is an infographic, again, the whole thing, and then a detail. This one is telling about the strangest divorce contentions. So things like a woman divorced her husband for cheating on her in a video game, just sort of very bizarre stories, and just putting a little illustration and then a little bit of text, and you can present a story, a bunch of strange stories all together here. So we've talked about rules a lot and sort of conventions. You also have the option to break those rules to illustrate what you're trying to say. So an example would be, again, we're presenting complex information quickly. This is showing that the topic is so complex that it's very difficult to represent. It's hard to understand. It's hard to look at. So this is showing the new healthcare law and sort of the networks and how these different pieces and different departments in the government relate to one another, and it's incredibly complex, and it's supposed to be. That's sort of the idea. Similarly, this is talking about government employees and sort of the idea of red tape. So again, it's something that's very complicated and complex, and showing you all of this information presented in this way using these colors is trying to tell that story. It's a part of representing that data, the way that this looks and the way it's hard to understand quickly. This example is illustrating all the things that BP could have bought with the money that they lost from the oil spill. So this is a horizontal infographic, which is really unusual. We talked about how they're sort of very long and vertical so you could scroll through them. This one I think I would say is probably represented in this horizontal way, so it really stands out and makes you think about how far you have to keep scrolling over. So this, some of the detail in here shows BP, with the money that they lost from the oil spill, they could have bought a house for each of the ones that was destroyed in Hurricane Katrina, and an ice cream sandwich for everyone on Earth, and Yahoo, just to pull out a detail from that graphic. So we can look at a huge number like that total at the end there and try to understand how big that is, but this I think is a really interesting graphic because it gives you a lot of examples and helps you really understand just how much money we're talking about here. So this, I'll just talk about one example of sort of the same information being represented in different ways. So there are a lot of infographics out there that talk about the internet minute, so like what happens online in 1 minute. So there's a company that has created a couple of infographics about this. So you can see in 60 seconds, all of these technology-related things happened. So there's one visualization, and then the same company created a second one with different data, but using the same kind of visualization. There's a, this is the same kind of a topic. This is talking about specifically mobile, but representing the same kind of idea, using the idea of a clock. Talk about 60 seconds. This one uses a totally different visual metaphor than any of those other ones, but it is telling the same sort of story. And then last, this one just has a really different look to it. This is talking about data every minute of the day. So again, sort of 60 seconds, what happens online. So this Internet Minute is just a good example because so many people are trying to chart this. So many people are trying to tell the story of how massive the web is and how many people are active on it. You can see many, many different representations of that same information that can look totally different and talk about the same topic. So we tried to pick some pretty cool infographics to show you. If you search around, though, you'll find that some are weaker than others. Some people don't follow the conventions, or they try, but something goes wrong. So just to talk about a few examples that are a little bit less successful. This graphic talks about the state of the USA in terms of food insecurity, obesity, and then SNAP participation and poverty. It's pretty complicated. There are several data points, but it doesn't take up very much space. It's also pretty hard to read because there's no clear hierarchy of how things are related to one another. So I think that's one reason that this is not, those are a couple of reasons this is not as successful as some of the other ones that we looked at. This graphic talks about Russia and the United States in terms of economy. What I do like about it is that it's pretty simple. What I think is not as successful about this graphic is it's hard to tell. There are very different things being compared here, and they're all using the exact same visualization. They're all using this bar chart. So it's really hard to tell how things are related to each other because they're all on the same scale using the same visualization. So I think it could be a little bit stronger if it used several different techniques that we've talked about. This graphic talks about cleaning and when you should clean. Everyone should be doing a load of laundry every single day. I hope you're aware. So I think this one struggles because of some of the fonts, and the colors are not quite as modern as some of the others that we've been looking at. There are maybe, I would say, too many different fonts. It can look really cool to use several different fonts, but if you go overboard, it just looks like it kind of has an identity crisis. It's harder to tell what it's trying to say when there are just too many fonts. So I think that that's something that this graphic struggles from. Again, this sort of same colors, same font issue that is happening in the other graphic. This is an example of a graphic that uses a lot of text, maybe a little bit too much text, or the text is not, again, it's hard to tell what's most important. So the idea of visual hierarchy in infographics, I think, is really, really important. And with this, it's really hard to tell what the most important points are. When you look at it from far away, it's very long, like some of those other ones, but you can't at a glance see really any information about it. You have to look at each individual piece. And I think that that's not a very successful way to design your graphic. So thinking about some critique and how these might be improved, I think, can be helpful. So we've looked at many examples now. We've talked about some of the ideas, what can you accomplish, what you could use an infographic for. Next, I want to move into the different types of visualizations and kind of breaking down each of these graphics. But before I do that, I just wanted to give some extra time for any questions that may have come up. So if you have any questions, let us know in the chat. I'll just give you a minute to think of anything or type if you need to. I'm going to take a sip of water. All right, Whitney says we're good so far. All right, well, I'll go ahead and talk more about the different types of visualizations, and if questions come up, you can let us know whenever you want. So again, infographics are usually not, they may have one kind of dominant image in the middle, but they're usually several different types of visualizations all grouped together. So this is a sort of flow chart for choosing visualization. So it starts in the center. What would you like to show? So are you talking about a relationship? Are there variables that you're trying to show how they relate to each other? Are you doing a comparison? Are you showing how things are distributed? Or are you doing a composition? So these are kind of different standards for sort of data visualization. When you have data in front of you, you want to think about what you're trying to show, and thinking of it in these 4 different types can help lead you to picking the right type of visualization for the data that you have in front of you. So we'll go through a few of those. Some of them maybe are probably familiar, some of them may be new to you or you haven't used them before. So one of the most basic is the bar chart, so showing comparisons of things. This chart is showing the top 10 most read books in the world. So the first one is the Bible, and then jumps way down to the second, which is quotations from Chairman Mao, and then Harry Potter, which I think is just pretty funny to look at the wide range of the top 3 there. One thing that bar charts can do really successfully is work with data that you're talking about really big numbers. You can represent that in a really simple way. So this is talking about, there are just 10 books, but the sort of number of how many books is in millions over the past 50 years. So that 3,900 is referring to 3,900, and then you can see it's sort of graphed in millions. So you're talking about a really huge, potentially hard to understand, it's hard to comprehend number of data. So a bar chart is a way to represent that in the small space that you have. So that's one way that they can be really successful. Pie charts. I did manage to find a pie chart about pie, so I was pretty excited about that. So this chart is showing NPR did a survey about favorite types of pie. And attempting to prove that, the idea of as American as apple pie is true. So apple pie did do pretty well. So pie charts attempt to compare parts to a whole. So NPR had survey data, they knew sort of the boundaries of their data, and they were able to represent out of all of these, how do those parts break down? So that's what's most successful with a pie chart. Scatter plots and line charts. So this is an illustration of a scatter plot. A line chart is basically a scatter plot where those points are connected to each other. This is a good way to show a trend. If you notice trends in your data, this is a really simple way to illustrate that. Area charts, that's sort of a big term to refer to lots of different types of visualizations that do things like show change over time. Let me move this over a little bit here. There we go, that's better. You can also compare different things using a bubble chart, so that the one on the right is a bubble chart. So the size of that bubble indicates how often or how important, and also the location of the bubble on the page, so that this chart shows the first one there, the first area chart is about congressional spending, and then the second one's about vitamins and supplements. So I like that bubble chart because you can use the height, and then you can use the size of the bubble to represent a lot of different things. So this one is charting scientific evidence about vitamins and then also popularity at the same time. So that's something that can be really hard to understand, and they do a lot in one infographic. And if that's a topic that interests you, that graphic is actually like live on the web, so you can click through and move things around and compare the sort of variables that you're looking at. So that's, in addition to being something that's really effective in print or statically, it's also a really cool live visualization. So check it out if you're interested. Maps, again, are one of the most common infographics that we see probably. So the maps here, we're looking at data about Starbucks and then also about McDonald's. So there's a map as sort of the core, but this graphic actually uses several of the different types of visualizations we've looked at. So there's a bar chart there. There are some bubble charts and maps. So lots of different types of information are all being combined here, and lots of different types of visualizations go together. Venn diagrams, so to show a graphic that we've already looked at, if you're trying to illustrate that the important elements of your data are the intersections between different things, this can be a really simple, really powerful way to represent that using a Venn diagram. Pretty simple one. Flowcharts, so if you're trying to show processes or if you're trying to show relationships or a network, you can use the sort of idea of visualization like a flowchart. So moving people from one thing to another. This one's about happiness, so how to get to happiness. And this is a really easy to understand visual metaphor for a process or a set of steps. A lot of those were charts that you've probably seen before. One of the sort of conventions that infographics use that other data visualizations might not is the idea of glyphs, or some people say infograms, so using icons or graphics to represent numerical data in addition to numbers and sort of more traditional charts and graphs. So probably the most common example is this sort of restroom sign shape with a man and a woman. We're all familiar with that. We see that a lot. So the idea that of using glyphs is that you can represent numbers by how many times that image appears. So you can show a count. You can say, you know, each person equals 500 people. So you can talk about a very big data set and represent it in a simple way, and use numbers, use pictures combined in a really interesting way. So this graphic uses several different glyphs to talk about several different data points, and so that's pretty common in infographics, finding icons or small graphics to use. And so this is just an example of, again, there are many different types of visualizations. So if you're thinking about creating an infographic and you're feeling sort of overwhelmed by, you know, oh, I'm supposed to create something that's really huge and really complicated, it's pretty easy to break an infographic down into different parts. So looking at this, you can kind of see there are several different sections, and each of them has its own sort of visualization. So we've got some charts, some of those glyphs, different types of charts. So it can make it seem a little bit easier to get started. If when you have your data, you probably know what the different sort of sections are, and this is, you can kind of think of each section as its own thing, and then it might be a little bit easier to get started because you're just doing what you already know how to do in different ways. So any questions for now? Just looked at some of the different types of visualizations, and the last thing I want to talk about is getting started with actually creating graphics. So if there are any questions before I move on to that, go ahead and let us know in the chat. Okay, it doesn't look like anyone's typing for now, so I'm going to move on. Talk about steps in making an infographic. So David Takafandi and I sat down and tried to figure out what we thought the steps were, and then sort of looking back, it seems it's pretty similar to writing a research paper or to other types of work that you've probably done before. So first you have to pick a topic, you have to gather data, you have to analyze the data, you have to decide what you want to say, what's the point that you're trying to make. You need to determine who the audience is, and this can be sort of a unique issue for infographics because you're considering also what the format is. Is it going to be for people to look at on a phone or on the web? Is it a poster? Is it going to go into an article? So audience not only means sort of the level of your writing, but also what the sort of format is going to be. It's important to plan an infographic. You may want to make a wireframe or a mock-up, so sort of a really pared down design that shows where different pieces are going to be. We thought it was pretty funny. One of our steps in making the infographic is make infographic. So once you have done all of that work, you actually need to sit down and use probably some software or maybe drawing and do the work of creating it. And then it's also really important to cite your sources. A lot of infographics, you'll see they have just kind of at the bottom a really small references list or a URL that links to where you can find all of the references. So it's really important to say where that data is coming from. Since you're saying something so powerfully using this visual imagery, you really want to make sure people can know where you got that information. So it's important to include some kind of citation on there. So we probably have different types of people in the listening audience today. Some of you may have data sets from original research. Some of you may be looking for data to play around with and to visualize. So I wanted to just quickly let you know about a resource that we have here in the library that helps you find data. So our data services librarian has created a really helpful guide that lets you know where you can find open data on the web, and then also data that you have access to through Penn Library resources. So this is a really great guide if you need to find some data to use and visualize. We won't have too much time to talk about that piece today, but this guide can help you get started. So I'll share this URL again at the end. We've talked a lot about what other people have said using infographics, how they're using them, what types of stories they're telling. If you're having trouble sort of telling a story, there are some things you could look for, a couple of quick tips on how to find stories. So you can look for outliers in the data. Is there one point that's way off from everything else? You can explore that. Trends, is it something that's so obvious it would be pretty easy to represent? Are the results counterintuitive? Is there something, we think things are a certain way, but the data illustrates that they're not? So these are just a few things you might look for if you're having trouble kind of finding a story in your data. So sort of getting to the nuts and bolts, you're going to want to find images and find type to use for your infographics. So we've talked about how powerful type can be. So you want to make sure you're making good choices. So this is an infographic about choosing a typeface. So it sort of takes you on a flowchart journey, asking you what kind of project you're trying to do, and helping you sort of pick a typeface, and then also illustrating just how complicated the idea of choosing type can be. To use another convention in another new way, this is another periodic table. So this one talks about typefaces and sort of groups them based on what type of type they are. Is it serif or sans serif? Stuff like that. To share another URL, so if the idea of making an infographic seems a little bit intimidating, if you're not a professional designer, you're in luck. There are a lot of resources available that can help you get started with graphic design, so understanding what fonts look good, actually getting fonts. There are links on this guide to find fonts that are free for you to use. The guide talks about images and media that you can reuse. It also talks about colors, so understanding color palettes, stuff like that. On the infographics guide, you'll find a lot of information about what we've talked about today, but there's also a tab on there that's just about design resources. And I think it's helpful for non-designers, because a lot of the sort of thinking about what colors look good together, stuff like that, has been done for you. There are a lot of resources out there for people like me, non-designers, who are trying to do a design project. And this guide will list a lot of resources that are free or free to you as someone who's affiliated with Penn. So if you're feeling a little intimidated by that, hopefully this will help you out. So tools to use to make infographics, I say from scratch, and I'll explain why in a minute. So if you want to build an infographic from the ground up, the easiest software for you to use would be PowerPoint. A lot of people already know how to use it. It's pretty user-friendly. It lets you put images, text, use colors, stuff like that. So you can sort of start with a blank canvas and build something. I will say, though, that most of the infographics that we've looked at are not built using PowerPoint. So if you want to make infographics professionally, or if you want to make infographics that look like the professional ones we've looked at today, you will probably want to start learning a tool like InDesign, or Illustrator, InDesign, or Photoshop are the three icons that we have there in order. InDesign is designed for creating print publications like books or even flyers. So if you're creating something for print, you may want to get started with InDesign. Illustrator and Photoshop are designed for building things on the web or making images that you can then put into your InDesign publication. So if you haven't used any of these tools before, we do offer workshops on them in the Weigel Information Commons. You have help available in our staff. The lab staff are all really well versed in these products and they can help you get started. Another resource I just wanted to mention is lynda.com, which we can give you access to. Just search our website for it and you can find out how to use Lynda. And you can start to learn some of these software packages. They're very complex, but you can start getting to know some of the pieces that you need to know to get started pretty quickly. So I would recommend checking out one of those resources, our workshops, or lynda.com tutorials if you're interested in getting started. I'm going to talk a little bit more about Illustrator and Photoshop because I think those are the two that are most commonly used. So a very quick overview here because I know we're getting close to our time. Photoshop uses raster graphics and Illustrator uses vector graphics, and really quickly what that means, raster refers to pixels. So every box has colors in it and those pixels come together to form an image. Vector graphics use points. And this is a little complicated, but what is most important to know is that raster graphics, if you stretch them out, they start to look pixelated, like the cherries on the left there. Vector graphics, since they're composed of points, no matter how big or how small you're making it, it will always redraw that picture, so it doesn't matter, it's not going to get stretched out looking. And the thing that you want to know in this context, raster graphics, we're pretty much talking about Photoshop there, and then vector graphics, that refers to what you do in Illustrator. So that's maybe the most important thing to know about that for right now if you're thinking about getting started with a tool. If you don't know if you're going to make a poster or an icon on a website, you may want to try to learn the vector graphics because you can make them big or small. But that's just a really quick tutorial on sort of the important differences between Photoshop, which is the raster graphics, and Illustrator, which does the vector graphics. And I know that's a little complicated, so if you have questions about that, we can talk about that at the end. So those are some resources for starting completely from scratch. I did also want to share some tools for creating infographics that are sort of the more plug in your data and play around with templates. So these are free or freemium, they all have free accounts, tools that help you design infographics using themes and templates. So you don't need to start from a completely blank canvas. My favorite are probably the top two on there, Infogram and then Flowchart. They're really simple to use and you can make something that looks professional in a couple of minutes. Then the other ones easily visually, again, are free tools that help you design infographics. Visually is an interesting one because it lets you use data that's already out there, especially like social media data. So if you wanted to visualize your Facebook profile or your Twitter account, you can do that in like 30 seconds using Visually. The last one is Many Eyes, which is a tool from IBM, I think, which helps you create data visualizations, and it's pretty complex. The other ones are pretty simple. You'll want to probably use smaller data sets. Many Eyes will let you do something that's very complicated, so it's a very complex data visualization product. The other ones are more designed just for infographics, so they're a little bit simple and pared down. And again, if there are questions about any of these particular tools, I'd be happy to answer them in the chat here. But we only have a couple of minutes left, so I wanted to just share again the URLs that I mentioned earlier. The top one there is our data guide at Penn Libraries, so that's a guide to help you get started finding data that's available to you to visualize. The second there is our infographics guide, which includes some of the content from this workshop and then also graphic design resources. And we'll probably post the recording of this session on there. So that's where you might want to get started on our website when you're ready to start creating your infographics. And then last, A source of help for you could be our email address. That's wic1@pobox.upenn.edu. It goes to all the staff here in the Weigel Information Commons, and all of us know a little bit about what we talked about today, and you'll get a response from one of our staff pretty quickly. So it's a great resource for you if you do have questions and you just want to talk to a human being about any of what we looked at today. So it's just about a minute before 4 o'clock. Want to make sure to end on time because I know folks are busy and have places to go, but I'm happy to stay in the room for a few more minutes and answer any questions that you have. When I'll post these slides on our website, and they do have the image credits at the end, so if there are any of these images that you want to go back and find later on, they'll be there, and then you can also find links to get back to them. So I'll be happy to share that with anybody who's interested.